which are not feminist political issues.
Rae, I think that's a great point. We want to get to it, but I want to get just a little bit back to definitions. I mean, it's easy to say, well, just define your terms and let's go on. But McKinnon and company, we're on to a real phenomenon. It ought to have a name. It ought to be discussed. Maybe there should be laws about it. But to use the term pornography for that particular phenomenon means that certain questions can't be raised that ought to be raised. I think there are explicit sexual depictions, things that I can't say I wouldn't want my children to see because they're all grown, but I certainly wouldn't want my grandchildren to see, that I don't think are necessarily offensive to women or represent women as objects or anything like that. They're just sexually explicit studies of organs. I regard them as pornographic. I wouldn't want my grandchildren to see them. Then there are other things that debase women, and there's an additional reason I wouldn't want my grandchildren to see them. I might not want anybody to be able to see them. But if we don't have a word that, why take a word that has a good descriptive content and load it up? It is, I think, the judges were right. It invites, at any rate, conceptual confusion.
I think that she had a point, and part of what she was wanting to do was to say that thing that you call pornography in this neutral sense, I want you to think of that, or I want you to think of most of that as having political import, as being a civil rights violation. So I think she had a rhetorical point there. Myself, I would be quite happy to use a definition of pornography which was more neutral, but then we would, let's say, have a label of objectifying pornography or subordinating pornography that would be the object of our attention.
Right. I agree with your impulse. I would be willing to have a more neutral term and then focus in on the stuff that we think is morally problematic and ask why we think the stuff that we think is morally problematic is morally problematic. And I want to get to that because you talked about, I think you agree with the idea that some of these representations objectify women. And I take it objectifying means treat as a thing, right? McKinnon thinks not only treat as a thing, but somehow turn into a thing or something like that.
That's right.
Let's not focus on McKinnon because I think we have actually a much clearer philosopher here to talk to. And I think you made a good distinction, but let me see if I can put it. In other words, I think there's a historical element here too. I mean, the porn industry used to be controlled by the people who controlled it when it was basically just an industry aimed at seedy old men. Now it's turned into something quite different. But there is a subset of pornography that clearly is exploitative of women. But I think you're making a claim, or at least you're raising a question. How about just ordinary pornography that doesn't objectify anybody any more than anyone else, but it's just a depiction of an act without emotion, without interest, without higher goals, without a relationship? Isn't that in itself objectionable, whether or not it's of the special subtype that McKinnon was interesting? Isn't that the second question you were trying to get us to focus on?
What you're asking about is now the merely explicit and arousing material.
Yeah,
which is not objectifying.
Yeah, do we want the life? Do we want our lives? Do we want the lives of the people we love? Do we want the lives of people in general to think of sex more or less through the filter of this explicit pornography, which, judging by the way that people like Jay Leno and talk about it, has just become mainstream. It's not embarrassing for people to say that they look at pornography.
Yes, I think this is a great question. And it gets deeply into the heart of questions about what it takes for material to be objectifying in the first place. Because some philosophers have said, look, feminists should only be concerned with material that is whose content it's obvious that it's subordinating. So it's eroticizing hierarchy, or it's legitimating violence. But you're raising the more general question about what we do with an industry let's see, Anthony Burgess once gave a different definition of pornography as a substitute sexual partner, which is a very brief and minimal and neutral one. Well, what do we do with an industry that tries to set up substitute sexual partners to the extent that the practice of having sex with these invades the personal lives of the consumers in ways that not only women testify about, but many men do too, testify about how it affects their relationships with real women, and also, by the way, how it affects their own sexual lives. I mean, one thing that's clear is that it gets them bored with sex.
Well, these are interesting and tough questions, and I think we have to dig into them some more, but I also want to invite some callers into this conversation. You can join this conversation by calling 1-800-525-9917. That's 1-800-525-9917, or as always, you can email us at comments@philosophytalk.org. We're talking about pornography with our guest, Rae Langton, and we've got a caller on the line now, Brian in Menlo Park. Brian, welcome to Philosophy Talk. What's your comment or question?
Oh, thank you very much. Enjoying the show. A couple of comments. It seems virtually impossible to find pornography on the internet that's not really vile and revolting and disgusting. And I remember when Playboy presented its Playmate of the Month as the girl next door. Seems to be the case now only if you're living next door to a brothel. And I asked a woman I know who's a sex therapist why this is the case. She said, well, that's because men are afraid of women. Second comment is that with increasing freedom and liberties, pornography has become increasingly violent and degrading of women, which suggests that men have this kind of hate and fear of women. And if that's increasingly true, an increasingly revealed portrait of human nature and the male side of it, that's really something to be frightened about.
Brian, you're making a very good point, and Rae, I want your thoughts about this. So I sometimes wonder if pornography is the way it is because male sexuality is the way it is, and male desire and male economic power is what's behind it. So it's something like, is there something intrinsic to male sexuality that gives rise to this thing? What do you think?
I doubt very much that there's something just intrinsic as such to male sexuality. I mean, that means that men are more likely to want to sort of give up on real women. I'm not saying give up, but sort of have their... I mean, to me, it would be a bit like believing in original sin, to believe that our natural sex instincts go for eroticization of hierarchy and so on. I think that Brian's question, though, is a really, Brian's comment is a really terrific one, and I don't know whether his colleague or neighbor or whoever it was said this, but it sounds to me as though there are a couple of issues. One thing that is very clear and has been said by people working in the porn industry themselves is that there's a tendency for escalation. So there's a tendency for traditional sex to be counted as completely boring, and you move past that really soon. And the way that the internet is set up is that you're lured in through ever-expanding sites to more and more extreme sites.
But Rae, I want to go back. I want to step back a second because I agree with you about that, but I don't want to let my fellow males off the hook too quickly. I was watching watching an old episode of Sex and the City the other night, and one of the characters said, "I wish I could go to bed like a man." That is, I wish I could go to bed without any worry about ongoing attachment and this, that, and the other thing. Get up the next morning and just be done with it, and Now, that was a representation of male sex. Now, one of the things some guys think about sex with women is the problem is the women. If you could get the sex and not have to deal with the emotional demands and all that sort of stuff. And pornography says not only can you get the sex without having to deal with the emotional demand, but the women will love it, right? You don't think that's a response to some facts about male sexuality?
Well, Okay, so what you say resonates very much with interviews that I've seen with consumers of pornography. So I'm thinking of one who said, I don't see how any male who likes porn can think actual sex is better, at least if it involves all the crap that comes with having a real live female in your life. I mean, that gets that... that real life females are trouble. Real life females talk back. They don't always say they don't always say yes. They take more than the ideal porn time to reach orgasm. There are lots of nuisance factors with real live females.
Well, I don't want to disagree with that, but I want to separate a couple of issues. First, our caller Brian made an empirical claim, which is that